Hegel and Nietzsche. The phenomenology of spirit's unique appeal, amply felt throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, is due in large part to Hegel's tremendous faith in the power of human reason. Indeed, few other modern thinkers have placed such high hopes in philosophy's ability to reform human consciousness and free ordinary reason from its constitutive limitations. And this attitude is all the more remarkable, since it can hardly be put down to a superficial engagement with human reason or to an indulgent diagnosis of consciousness' intrinsic limitations. If Hegel does stand out for his philosophical optimism, his work is no less notorious for its radical denouncement of human ignorance. In the Phenomenology, these two aspects are mutually related. On the one hand, following a long lineage of critical thinkers, Hegel argues that the attainment of truth is conditional on the exposure of the intrinsic limitations of our ordinary mode of cognition. On the other hand, departing from the critical tradition, he claims that this negative procedure can have a positive outcome. He seeks to show that the untruth of ordinary knowledge is not simply untrue, but an undeveloped form of truth. Irrationality is itself bound to a rational principle, and the critic's task is to identify this principle and follow where it leads. Hegel's skepticism is thus a dynamic skepticism, where every particular criticism is the direct consequence of a previous criticism, and the necessary antecedent of a new one. Human ideas and judgments are no longer taken up at random, as in Plato's dialogues, but placed within a global cognitive map, whose main itinerary allows for no detours. This ambitious strategy is grounded in two revolutionary convictions, which set the phenomenology apart from all previous philosophical works. First, Hegel attempts to show that all aspects, dimensions, and areas of human knowledge amount to different perspectives on the same cognitive whole. Whereas most of us tend to regard the fields of experimental science, morality, psychology, politics, religion, or art as different worlds, whose aims and methods are irreducible to each other, Hegel regards them as different semblances of the same overarching notion. The phenomenology's aim is to dissolve these distinctions and bring about a truly global cognitive perspective, as rich and as complex as life itself. Second, Hegel also argues that this final perspective, due to the very form of the progression, is necessarily set for consciousness. If the different stages were merely added together in the form of an aggregate, the progression might go on indefinitely, with no guarantee of success, but this is not the case. For Hegel, reason is inherently systematic, which means that the standpoint of science is not merely possible, but indeed logically necessary. Although consciousness may never leave the realm of untruth, the possibility of actual knowledge is no less real and within human reach. With these two convictions, Hegel raised philosophy's old faith in reason and rationality to an unprecedented height. At the same time, however, his systematic solution can be seen as the final expression of this faith. Hegel was one of the last, if not the last, greatest Western thinker to believe in the possibility of a truly sovereign mode of cognition, free from the chains of illusion and self-deceit. He was one of the last to hold that the contradictions that plague human life can be cured through reason and not against it or beyond it or in spite of it. After Hegel, the philosophical canon shifted in an entirely new direction. His optimism was replaced by a fundamental mistrust of reason and science. From Schopenhauer's pessimism to Kierkegaard's existentialism, from Marx's materialism to Husserl's and Heidegger's pre-theoretical turn, Hegel's insistence on harmony and reconciliation was inherited by a historical age at odds, perhaps more than any other, with the ideas of fragmentation, disharmony, and conflict. To borrow Karl Löwith's formula, the revolutionary break in 19th century German philosophy coincided, to a great extent, with the rejection of Hegel and the emergence of different alternatives to systematic rationalism. In this context, Nietzsche is often pointed out as Hegel's most obvious countertype. This contrast is based on a number of well-known differences, which refer both to the content and to the form of their writings. Whereas Hegel is ultimately an optimist, Nietzsche is famous for his Dionysian pessimism. Whereas Hegel is the quintessential systematic philosopher, Nietzsche is renowned for his dispersed aphorisms. Whereas Hegel is a difficult and often abstruse writer, Nietzsche's prose is usually elegant and mordacious. But Hegel's and Nietzsche's works also display important similarities. Firstly, both of their philosophies are built around the idea of science or truth, and both can be interpreted as an attempt to answer the main challenge posed by the critical tradition. Nietzsche's idea of truth, just like Hegel's, is deeply influenced by the critical diagnosis set forth in Plato's dialogues. In his eyes, our usual cognitive perspective is flawed and self-deluded, burdened with unwarranted assumptions about ourselves and the world. These assumptions are, for the most part, automatic, embedded in human cognition, and rarely called into question. Furthermore, these assumptions are not restricted to a specific brand of ideas or judgments, nor to a specific domain of experience. They contaminate the whole edifice of human reason and condition every aspect of human life. Secondly, like Hegel, Nietzsche also regards reason's inner contradictions as a form of imprisonment and servitude. In line with the Platonic tradition, he also describes human life as a downgraded life, and human beings as downgraded beings, reduced to a lesser version of their original selves, confined to a mode of cognition that compromises their power to choose and act freely. Moreover, he also construes philosophy's critical role as a liberating task, destined to reverse this state of affairs and re-establish humankind's original independence. Thirdly, both Hegel and Nietzsche envisage this liberating movement as a cultural process, and both turn to the history of human reason to illustrate its main implications. What is more, the Hegelian and Nietzschean historiographies of freedom share many important references. For one thing, both denote a clear fascination with the primordial innocence of the ancient Greek world, contrasted with the cultural degeneration of the modern Western world. In both accounts, the birth of Greek tragedy and the emergence of Socratic and Platonic dialectics constitute important conceptual innovations, with profound implications on the nature and scope of human freedom. Furthermore, Hegel and Nietzsche also highlight the cultural and conceptual role played by religion in the definition of freedom, and particularly by the rise and evolution of the Jewish and Christian traditions. Finally, both authors view Kant's critical project as a defining moment in the history of modern reason, with important repercussions on the definition of freedom. However, these generic coincidences can only tell us so much. Hegel's and Nietzsche's historiographical appraisals are not only very different, but, in many respects, antithetical. Hegel regards the phenomenological history of human cognition as the necessary path towards the actualization of freedom. On his view, each stage is necessary and liberating, provided it is correctly understood. Although the harmony of Greek Sittlichkeit was irredeemably lost, its sacrifice was needed for the attainment of personal freedom. Although primitive Christianity was a source of unhappiness, it played a decisive role in the development of modern reason. And although Kant's critical philosophy increased consciousness's self-awareness, its contradictions still call for a new Aufhebung and a more complete form of deliverance. For Nietzsche, on the contrary, the idea that freedom is dependent on a systematic inquiry is seriously mistaken. Unlike Hegel, he rejects the basic premise of Plato's philosophical project and regards the pursuit of science not as a form of liberation, but as the primary cause of human bondage. Whilst Plato and Hegel anchored their criticism of human cognition in the notion of truth and set about denouncing the untrue nature of most human concepts and beliefs, Nietzsche argues that this grounding notion must itself be criticized. Its philosophical protagonism notwithstanding, the notion of truth is just a mere assumption, as groundless and unintelligible as all other human assumptions. Therefore, only a critical philosophy that is capable of acknowledging and overcoming this prejudice can actually be liberating. Whereas Plato and Hegel advocated a release from untruth, or a release through science, Nietzsche reverses this general plan. He advocates a release from truth, or a release from science, and the embracement of a wider and freer standpoint. Accordingly, Nietzsche's engagement with the history of human reason is very different from Hegel's. While Hegel viewed Greek dialectics, Christian morality, and modern reason as necessary stages in the road to freedom, Nietzsche sees them as different and increasingly dogmatic incarnations of the scientific ideal, and hence as different and increasingly rigid forms of imprisonment. In his eyes, the long odyssey of human culture reflects, for the most part, the long evolution of the same grounding prejudice, a philosophical parti pris whose genealogy must be exposed and overcome.